다음은 보스턴대 멜컴 데이비드 맥클 교수님을 모시고 인도 중관파의 명상, 철학과 보살도에 대한 강의를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 멜컴 데이비드 eckel 교수님은 여기 동국대학교의 서광 스님의 지도 교수님이시기도 하시고요. 보스턴대 종교학과 교수이시고 하버드 신학대학 교수님을 역임하셨고 청변과 반대자들 붓다 만나기라는 책이 저술이 있습니다. 박수로서 데이비드 eckel 교수님을 모시겠습니다.
Greetings, everyone. My name is David Eckel. I'm going to be speaking to you today about meditation, philosophy, and the Bodhisattva path in Indian Madhyamaka philosophy. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, especially the Venerable Sogwang Sunim, for the privilege of speaking to you today in this Second Seoul International Meditation Festival. What fun. I wish I were there in Seoul to enjoy it with you. It's a great honor once again to join a forum sponsored by Dongguk University. I have tremendous respect for all you do to support the study of Buddhism in Korea and around the world. I'm sorry that I cannot speak to you in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you by a recorded message. While the COVID crisis may, in many respects, have kept us apart, I feel that it also has allowed us to establish connections that in other times would have been difficult or even impossible. I am with you in spirit today, and I share your interest in Buddhist meditation. As a professor of Buddhist philosophy, I often meet Buddhist practitioners who ask me whether I practice meditation. I explain that I'm a scholar, and my practice of meditation is to study the philosophy. When I say this, I'm not just trying to avoid the question. I believe that the study of Buddhist philosophy can be a form of meditation, as is true in some traditions of Western philosophy. But I will not try to make that argument in this lecture. At least I will not try to make it directly. Instead, I'd like to focus on the way a number of important Indian Madhyamaka philosophers presuppose some form of meditation as preparation for the study of philosophy. By understanding how they situate philosophy in relation to meditative practice, I think we can develop a more nuanced understanding of what I take to be the topic of this conference, the connection between meditation and other forms of Buddhist life. Since time is short and the questions are complex, I'd like to focus on a genre of literature that will be particularly useful. This is the genre of the Madhyamaka so-called introduction to the Bodhisattva path. The best known example of this type of literature is Shantideva's Introduction to the Practice of Awakening. The Sanskrit title is Bodhicharyavatara. But this literature is rooted in an earlier text known as the Introduction to the Nectar of Reality, Tattvamatavattara, by the 6th century Madhyamaka philosopher Bhaviveka. In many respects, Bhaviveka's text is eminently philosophical. It contains a long analysis of the categories accepted by the different schools that were active in Bhaviveka's time. These included not only the Buddhist Abhidharma, but also the Hindu traditions of the Sankhya and Vaisheshika. Later, in an extension of the same text, he took up the Yogacara, the Vedanta, and even the philosophy of the Jains. This analysis holds great interest for scholars of Indian philosophy. But what should interest us is not the analysis itself, but the connection Bhaviveka draws between his philosophy and the discipline of meditation. Bhaviveka begins the philosophical portion of his text, known as The Quest for the Knowledge of Reality, with a series of verses in praise of knowledge and wisdom. For him, the two terms mean essentially the same thing. The knowledge that philosophers seek is the wisdom that animates the path of a bodhisattva. He likes to think of knowledge as a way of seeing. True vision, he says, consists of knowledge and nothing else. So a wise person should concentrate on seeking knowledge of reality. Even if a wise person is blind, he can see the world without any obstruction. He sees whatever he wants to see, whether it is far away, subtle, or concealed. Even if someone has 1,000 eyes, he says, like the god Indra, and lacks wisdom, he is blind because he does not see the right and wrong paths to heaven and liberation. When someone opens the eye of wisdom, he does not enter into the perfections as if they were thorns poisoned by hope for results in this world or the next. Bhaviveka's depiction of knowledge as a kind of sight is not surprising in a tradition where one of the most common words for philosophy is simply the word vision or darshana. But he weaves this image of vision together in a rather clever way with the basic Buddhist idea of practice as a way of moving along a path. For him, a wise person is not just someone who sees the right path, but someone who can walk this path without falling into the thorns that sit on each side of it. Both these metaphors, the metaphor of seeing and walking, come into play when Bhaviveka talks about philosophers and the practice of meditation. The key verses begin with a line that says, a wise person, that is, somebody who intends to practice philosophy, should diligently practice mental concentration. Here the word for concentration is the well-known word samadhi, one of the most fundamental Buddhist words for meditation. Why is concentration so important for him? Bhaviveka answers first with a verse about vision. You cannot see your face in muddy water or water that has been stirred up by the wind. And you cannot see reality in a mind that is not concentrated or is covered by obstructions. Then he adds another verse about leading the mind onto the right path. When your mind strays from the right path, like an elephant, you should tie it to the post of its object with the rope of mindfulness and gradually bring it under control with the hook of wisdom. These verses are embedded in a remarkably detailed account of the practice a philosopher should use to attain this concentration. He begins, not surprisingly, with an account of mindfulness. How should a wise person concentrate the mind, he asks? By being mindful of the out-breath and the in-breath. Here, exhaling pushes the breath out and inhaling draws it in. One should locate mindfulness of these two breaths on the tip of the nose and then count. First, count forward when exhaling, starting with 10 and going up to 100. Then do the same in reverse. Or one should practice mindfulness of breathing in another way. Exhaling pushes the short breath out as long, hot, and foul smelling. Inhaling draws the breath in as short, cold, and sweet smelling. One should be mindful of these breaths as arising from the navel and extending to the tip of the nose, extending also through the whole body to the tips of the toes. I wonder how students would respond in my seminar on Buddhist philosophy if I insisted that we start every class with a few minutes of mindful breathing, just like this. I imagine it would change the tone of the class, probably for the better. But Bhaviveka does not stop with an account of mindfulness. He goes on to discuss what might loosely be called motivational practices. Perhaps these are familiar to you from your own practice of meditation. He says that someone who is puffed up by pride about family or about youthfulness or about physical appearance should be calmed by contemplating impermanence. Someone whose mind is narrow should expand the mind by concentrating on something vast, like a large sutra. I don't know quite what he means here, but he may mean lots of recitation of sutras, or perhaps he even suggests that one should memorize a large sutra. That's a little bit unclear. If the mind is distracted, it should be focused by considering the suffering that results from distractions. If it is depressed, it should be lifted up by considering the benefits of courage. If it is stained by the mud of passion, hatred, or delusion, it should be washed by the water of revulsion, friendliness, and dependent arising. Finally, when the mind has become isolated, stable, peaceful, focused on its object, skillful, and supple, the practitioner should cultivate detachment even toward the mind itself. It's only when the mind has been concentrated like this that a scholar is ready, cognitively and emotionally, to analyze the nature of reality. I do not imagine that Bhaviveka is insisting on a preliminary discipline of mental concentration for aspiring scholars, but he has an unusually broad and encyclopedic imagination. His philosophical works tell us more about the details of his opponent's views than almost any other text in this period. So much so that he is a unique source for information about subjects as different as Nikaya Buddhism, mainstream or Theravada Buddhism, and the origins even of non-dual Vedanta. It's not surprising that he gives us a distinctive view of the meditative preparation for a Buddhist philosopher. For Bhaviveka, the analysis of reality was not just a dry academic discipline. It was embedded within a larger system of Buddhist practice. It would not be surprising to find a similar connection between meditation and philosophical practice in the work of later Madhyamikas too, especially those who helped carry Indian traditions to Tibet. But what I would like to do next is step back, broaden the focus, and ask a larger question about the relationship between the analysis of reality and the practice of the Bodhisattva path. Bhaviveka suggests this connection in the titles of the two chapters that precede his quest for the knowledge of reality. The first is not relinquishing the mind of awakening. The second is taking the vow of an ascetic. By the time Bhaviveka gets to the analytical portion of his text, the portion that we have identified as philosophical, he has already laid the foundation in the basic principles of the Bodhisattva path, including the practice of compassion and generating the mind of awakening. What is the relationship then between philosophy and these more fundamental Mahayana values? To answer this question, I would like to turn the clock forward a few centuries to another work in the same genre of literature, to the introduction to the practice of awakening by the 8th century Madhyamaka, Shantideva. Shantideva's text has become justifiably famous in scholarly circles for its marriage of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist practice. Opening the text, it's easy to see why. It begins with a remarkably astute description of the emotional dynamic involved in generating the mind of enlightenment, the fundamental aspiration that motivates the progress of a bodhisattva. It's framed in the context of a ritual in which the practitioner confesses his own inadequacy, offers the mind in homage to great Buddhas and bodhisattvas, and then receives it back as a mark of being accepted into the family of the Buddha. Today, my birth is fruitful, it says. My human life is justified. Today, I am born into the family of the Buddha. Now, I am the Buddha's child. I'm always struck by the shift in the emotional tone during the process of this ritual, from the humility and even really from the fear that characterizes the start of the ritual, to the sense of relief bordering on a kind of grandiosity that brings the ritual to an end. In a general sense, these verses should be considered a form of meditation in the sense that they are meant to bring about a change in the practitioner's sense of self and affect about the world. But meditation enters the text in a more formal way in the 8th chapter, where Shantideva takes up the practice of mental concentration or samadhi, preparing the way, like Bhaviveka, for the wisdom that comes in the next chapter. At first, Shantideva seems to develop many of the same themes that concerned Bhaviveka. The first verse speaks, for example, of avoiding distractions. One should stabilize the mind in concentration, since a person whose mind is distracted stands in the fangs of the defilements. He also sings the praises of isolation, but he saves his most intense and memorable verses for the practice of revulsion, the Ashubha Bhavana. Bhaviveka mentioned revulsion briefly as a way to wash away the mud of passion. Shantideva develops it into a vivid and almost nightmarish meditation on the filth of the human body. In these verses, Shantideva follows in Bhaviveka's footsteps, but the text soon takes a different turn. When the mind has been concentrated in this way, Shantideva says, the practitioner should begin to develop the awakening mind By meditating intently, the word for meditation here is bhavana, could be translated as bringing into being, on the equality of self and other. Modern interpreters of Shantideva have rightly focused on this meditation as the crux of the text. What does Shantideva have in mind? The idea is to cultivate an attitude of concern for others by seeing them as an extension of the self. In its most radical formulation, it involves a meditation on the exchange of self and other by making a deliberate effort intellectually and emotionally to put another person's happiness ahead of one's own. J. Garfield expresses the complexity of this concept in his own striking description of the mind of awakening, the bodhicitta. Bodhicitta, he says, is a complex psychological phenomenon. It is a standing motivational state with a cognitive and affective dimension. It centrally involves an altruistic aspiration grounded in care to cultivate oneself as a moral agent for the benefit of all beings. What I find striking about Shantideva's formulation of this compassionate aspiration is the way it crosses the line from meditation to analysis. The meditation itself is expressed in a form of argument, strangely enough. Verse 94 of this chapter, for example, takes the form of a classic three-part Indian inference with an assertion, a reason, and an example. I should eliminate the suffering of others, it says, because it is suffering, like my own. And I should also benefit others, because they are sentient beings, like myself. This is the same style of inference that Bhaviveka applied to his analysis of reality. In that sense, it is eminently philosophical. But here, in Shantideva's chapter on mental concentration, it becomes an argument in service of compassion. The line between philosophy and meditation has been blurred, if it has not been obliterated altogether. The reason for this is not difficult to understand. The subject of the next chapter, where Shantideva treads in Bhaviveka's footsteps and analyzes the views of his philosophical opponents, the subject is emptiness, the radical extension of the fundamental Buddhist concept of no self. What could be a more helpful preparation for the exploration of emptiness than to meditate on the moral and emotional significance of no self? Shantideva will have a lot to say about the intellectual understanding of emptiness in the next chapter. Here he is interested in the feeling of emptiness, what it feels like to be empty of self, to try switching places with someone else and let the boundary between self and other disappear. Shantideva's approach to selfhood here in this chapter on mental concentration gives us a more complex and nuanced understanding of the relationship between meditation and philosophy. It's not just that meditation prepares for the analysis of emptiness, meditation also is infused by the attitude of emptiness. Bhaviveka gestured in this direction early in his chapter on seeking the knowledge of reality, where he said, someone who has opened the wisdom eye practices the perfections, pure in three ways. with compassion as the motivation and omniscience as the goal, but he does not set his mind on that goal. Not setting the mind on this goal means literally that the mind does not stand in omniscience. The same language appears in a key passage near the very beginning of the text, where Bhaviveka talks about the relationship of a bodhisattva to samsara and nirvana. Bodhisattvas, he said, have not stood in samsara because they see its faults, and they have not stood in nirvana because of their compassion, but they remain in samsara because of their promise to seek the welfare of others. In his commentary on this verse, Bhaviveka explains that the concept of the bodhisattva's no standing represents the bodhisattva's apratishtita nirvana, a concept that is almost impossible to translate in English. Perhaps you can do better with it in Korean. I bet you have. We sometimes translate this as unsupported or unstable nirvana, but the word literally means a nirvana that does not stand in either samsara or nirvana. As Bhaviveka explains, the bodhisattva does not apprehend or reify. The Sanskrit word here is upalub, to reach out and to grasp samsara and nirvana as being either different or the same. Why? Because the bodhisattva understands their emptiness. This point comes only at the beginning of the text. Bhaviveka doesn't take up the formal consideration of emptiness until much later, but it's fair to say that the understanding of emptiness infuses the practice of the bodhisattva right from the beginning of the path. The same is true at the beginning of Shantideva's account of the path. I mentioned earlier that his introduction begins with a formal ritual in which the aspiring bodhisattva praises the Buddha and confesses his own inadequacy. The ritual ends with the exultant, enthusiastic claim that the aspiring bodhisattva has been born into the family of the Buddha. How is this transformation possible in the course of just a few verses? It's precisely this sense of one's own inadequacy or selflessness that transforms the practitioner into an aspiring child of the Buddha. You might say that emptiness is like an alchemical elixir that brings about this transformation. It's precisely because there is no ultimate difference between things, as there is no difference between samsara and nirvana, that the aspiring bodhisattva can express this transformation right from the start. What can we say then in conclusion about the Madhyamaka approach to the relationship of emptiness and philosophy? From one perspective, it's clear that at least two significant Indian Madhyamakas thought that mental concentration, or samadhi, was a natural preparation for the intellectual and discursive study of emptiness. This mental concentration included not just mindfulness of the breath, as it did for Bhaviveka, but also more discursive practices, like the meditation on the repulsive state of the body. But we also have found that the contrast between meditation on one side and philosophy on the other begins to break down when we look more closely at the cognitive attitudes that they presuppose. This was particularly true in the case of Shantideva, where the cultivation of compassion mirrored the intellectual realization of emptiness. But it also was true in Bhaviveka's account of apratishtita, or unstable nirvana. We can conclude then that for these two representatives of the Indian tradition, meditation and philosophy are deeply intertwined. Not only does meditation prepare for the study of philosophy, but meditation is infused and animated by the values of philosophy. It is that entanglement of practice and thought that gives their view of the Bodhisattva path such eloquence and such continued relevance for us today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now turn you over to the organizers of the conference.
네, 데이비드 에클 교수님의 심도 깊은 강연이 있었습니다. 큰 박수로 전달해 주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다. 잠깐 내용을 살펴보면 청변과 산티데바의 집중과 보리심 그리고 명상과 철학의 관계는 연결되어 있다. 무주열반, 번뇌 즉 보리, 염념보리심 처처 안락고 생각마다 보리심을 가지면 항상 안락하다. 이런 내용의 말씀이셨습니다. 감사합니다.